If you're just coming into the series for the first time today, please do have a look at our schedule, future events, and mark some dates on your calendar. It's been a really exciting series so far. I'm very pleased about today's talk, and I think you'll find lots to interest you. I'm grateful, as always, to our friends here at the museum, and to Jeff Culver and Rebecca Bushnell in the School of Arts and Sciences for their support, as well as to those of you who have helped us with your contributions. A quick story. A couple of years ago, my family relocated for a year to London. We lived in London, which was great. It was fantastic. And my wife and I, we live in the suburbs, in a horrible suburb about 40 miles north of here, where there's another university, and people wear orange and black all the time, and it's really a loathsome city in many ways, or a town. And we love big cities, and we love walking in big cities, and so going to London for the year was great for us. But we had two kids, then 10 and 11, and they're not always easy to motivate for walking. So I made a deal with them before we went over that I would pay them $1 for every mile that they walked while we were abroad for a year. Not just in London, but in Madrid and Budapest and places we went. We did lots of walking. There were days where we walked like 14 and 15 miles. And the kids, they were very motivated. They were always proposing walks. And you know, you can't renege, you can't like change the rules, 50 cents with kids. So they were keeping track in the database, you know, day by day. Well, by the end of the year, they had earned a lot of money, and like hundreds and hundreds of dollars, right? But we hadn't rented a car or bought taxis or anything. So I said, all right, fine, so you got the money. What are you going to do with it? And they go, Xbox 360. And Wii had come out recently, another game console, and I said, what about Wii? No, Xbox 360. And I said, well, all right, Xbox 360. These consoles cost like $250. I don't know at the time. That's not that much money. You guys have a lot more money than that. They go, no, well, we need the screen. You know, like, you got to get a screen with it. And I go, but all right, but still, but like a screen and the console, you still are going to have a lot of money left over. And they go, no, Dad, we need two consoles and two screens. We're playing against each other. And I go, but wait a minute, in these games, it's like you each have a controller, and you know, they live in the same room. You're going to play against each other. You go, no, we're going to be playing online. So we're going to be, both of us, logging in separately to accounts on separate machines and playing online, virtually in a virtual world. And this is indeed what they did. So they live in the same space, but they have separate Xbox 360s, and they play against each other and others in a universe that's out there, you know, virtual. And this goes on constantly in the house. Whenever we don't have the blackout on games, which is sort of school nights and things, we have all these hours when they can't play games. But the very instant that the blackout is lifted, 5 p.m. on Friday or whatever, the games are going. So I'm all the time in the zone where there's a lot of gaming going on. And I try as a concerned parent to kind of be a little bit interested, to look, to watch, to talk to them about what they're doing, ask for advice, and or offer them advice. And not too long ago, I was looking at my son John playing, well, they were both playing, but I was looking at his screen. And he was shooting, they're always shooting things. And he was sort of running across the street, shooting these guys, and he was getting shot, you know. And I said, John, why don't you just duck behind this wall here and just pick those guys off when they're going across the alley? And he says, Dad, my other son goes, Dad! And he goes, that's camping! Campers are noobs. Campers are noobs. So I said, all right, this is the kind of response I get when I ask for clarification about the rules of the game. And the point that's been brought home to me is that there are a whole set of rules, what I would call mores. There's an elaborated system of constraints on selfishness, on meanness, on the kinds of practice or behavior that these gamers are allowed, even in the absence of any instruction book, any stated rules anywhere, any policing system, any overlords who say you can't do that. You can do whatever you want, but everybody sort of knows what they can do and what they can't do. So is this good? How did it happen? How does this process of rule making happen in the virtual world? Should I be pleased that my sons are doing this, that they're not campers and not noobs? Or should I follow my wife's advice and just take the machines out in the dark of the night and tell them we were burglarized? I don't know. No, I don't imagine that these are exactly the questions that our speaker, Douglas Thomas, is going to be addressing today. But Professor Thomas has done as much as any scholar I'm aware of to advance our understanding of the new logics of morality, of ethics, of appropriateness, of criminality, of licit and illicit practice that are co-emergent with the new technologies at play. He's a professor of communications at the other Annenberg at USC, founding editor of the leading journal in interactive media, Games and Culture, it's called. His own co-authored piece on the gamer disposition has been very widely cited and celebrated. His intellectual roots lie in Nietzsche, subject of his first book. And one is tempted to say that in his more recent writings, like his book, Hacker Culture, and the edited volume on cybercrime, and in his articles, he's been following the new technologies into a new moral space beyond good and evil. Or at the very least, he's helping us to translate these key terms into or onto a bewildering new media landscape. The title of his talk today is Technology, Outlaws, and the Morality of Play. Please join me in welcoming Douglas Thomas to the Penn Humanities Forum.
Thank you. That's a very interesting example that you use, and something I will talk a little bit about as I get to the gamer section. This is an interesting moment for me because for about 15 years I've been studying three different cultures. One has been the culture of computer hackers. Another has been the culture of those who write computer viruses. And the third has been the culture of computer gamers. And often I get to talk about them, but I usually get to talk about one or the other. So today I'm going to try to bring together all three of these cultures around the thematic of morality of play, of law issues. Let me just... There's my World of Warcraft character. I would say that my work in these areas has been motivated primarily by two questions. One is why is it that we tend to have an instant division that we make between what we consider the virtual on one hand and what we often call the real on the other? And there's a kind of insistence that dynamic or that binary keeps cropping up. So I've been very interested why that is, why we want to divide the world that way. And the second is why it is that we attach the questions of morality, of ethics, and of what counts as good more readily to the real than we do to the virtual. And almost always our interest is to ask, sure, that's happening online, but what is it really doing? Right? As if that's a kind of a valid distinction. In tracing these kind of things out, I think it boils down to one particular site where we can start to locate that question, and it has to do with the physical nature of both the people who play games, write viruses, and hack, and the worlds that they inhabit. And that space actually is the body. And the body becomes a very complicated notion when you start thinking about the intersection of aspects of the real and the virtual. So throughout, what I've wanted to kind of look at is the way in which law can attach itself to the body. And in that sense, also to look at what kind of boundaries we have or what kind of moralities we have around notions of play. And my work's been very influenced by a philosopher, Johann Huizinga, who wrote a book called Homo Ludens, which literally translates to humans as players. And he introduced the concept of what he called the magic circle. And the magic circle in the space of play is a kind of boundary that allows us to separate ourselves from the physical world and engage in a new set of rules, a new set of behaviors. And I think it's been widely misunderstood as a way of reinforcing that boundary between the virtual and the real. In fact, I think what he was saying was quite different. His idea is that play is so essential to our human nature that it actually tends to precede most of our cultural constructs. And he would include things like the law, which I'll talk about later, and even he has an entire chapter in the book about war as play. And he's not talking about war as something that's not serious. He's talking about war engaging in a kind of contest that looks very much like the kind of games that we play. What he talks about in terms of the magic circle is not that these things are divorced from reality, but they are spaces in which we can reflect upon the real. So what we bring into the magic circle, even though it has its own set of rules, is a kind of working through of the problems of the everyday, the problems of the world, the problems of our lives. So there's not a sense in Huizinga that the real and the virtual are in fact disconnected, but that they inflect on each other in very important and critical ways. And if you look at the research on sport, for example, particularly academic research, you see the same kind of argument happening, that rarely do people write books about sport that say sport is about sport. Right? Sport is about other things. It's about gender. It's about national identity. It's about performance. Right? It's about understanding ourselves through another thematic. And I think that if we look at what happens in virtual worlds, we can make a very similar kind of argument. So the point I want to make is that in these different worlds, it's not a matter of anything goes, but it's a matter of different things go. And I think this is sort of the example that you're talking about within Xbox 360, online games, those sorts of things. There are rules, right? And those rules are often understood through the experience of play. There are certain things which are no longer acceptable to do once you've been around for a certain period of time. And if you talk to virus writers, the thing that they're most interested in is not putting a bomb on your computer so that all the files get erased. What they're interested in is questions of particularly corporate control and corporate domination. Their understanding of how viruses work is that they need to maintain a certain fragile state to whatever system we're in so that it can never control us. So they have a kind of deep interest in questions of control and authority, which get worked through in terms of their practices. The same is true for hackers, that hackers have a very deep and profound interest in things like security. Even though they're constantly violating it, they're doing that oftentimes in a way that's justified by themselves as saying, if we don't find these holes, somebody else will. So they see themselves oftentimes as actually providing a public service of cleaning up after people who are sloppy coders. Gamers, I think the point that was being made is are very interested in ethics. And one of the ways that plays itself out is in a new set of definitions about what constitutes citizenship. So what's happening in those virtual worlds looks very much like asking the question, what does it mean to be a valued member of a society? And even though we're shooting each other, right, sitting there and camping and picking people off, that's not cool. Right? You don't do that unless you're a noob and then people come and they put an end to it. Right? So certain practices are considered fair or unfair, marks of experience or not. Even going to things like what kind of characters people create, what kind of roles they take on. There are certain ones that all the new people gravitate to, and then they become very passé for players who have been around for a long time. So the point of all these things is that difference is often reflective, and it tells us something about the contradictions that inherently exist in the real, in our real lives. And the argument I want to make today throughout each of these examples that I'll kind of trace out is that the virtual is bounded by its own law. But looking at that law starts to reveal the ways in which there are contradictions already in the real law that exists in the world. And when I get to the end, I'll try to trace some of those out for us. So the idea that the law and the body have a kind of codependent relationship. Right? If you think about the kind of things that we do in terms of the law, it's always kind of a manhunt. And this is exemplified in popular culture today around shows like CSI. Right? We have an entire police procedural, which is nothing but the trail of evidence which leads to the body. Right? What kind of things are left behind? What kind of ways can we use science to pick out the various elements of skin and hair and fibers and these sorts of things, which ultimately lead us to the real body, the physical body, the actual body. And there's a sense in which, without the body, the law itself becomes impotent. It can't do very much. Look at the recent case of Roman Polanski, right? Who's, they're constantly trying to extradite because they can do nothing to him without his body. Or recent debates over Guantanamo and the whole point of habeas corpus, one of the most foundational elements of our law going back to common law in England, which is produce the body. Right? The body has to be there or the body has to be released. And that's the crux of what makes the law work. Now, I'm kind of a Nietzschean and Foucauldian by temperament and training. And it's not lost on me the fact that both of them talk extensively about the ways in which the body has played a critical role in understanding how it is that we create the moral structure of our society. So if you look at Nietzsche's work in a book called On the Genealogy of Morals, he talks about the insistence of using pain to inflict upon the body some sort of torture to produce memory. And things like up and through the early 20th century in America and slightly earlier in Europe, things like public executions were witnessed not only by the citizenry, but by the children. Right? It was a moral duty for you to bring your child to witness a public execution. Right? That's how you burned into the mind the memory that stealing is bad, murder is bad, killing the king is bad, all those sorts of things. So the body has had a critical role in the structure of law, the structure of punishment, all of those ideas. It's been quite critical. And finally, I want to sort of mention a very interesting irony that happens. This is a hacker by the name of Cancer Omega, and he tattooed on himself a 3-line code. That 3-line code is the RSA encryption algorithm, which was classified by the United States government as a munition. And quite seriously, if you look up, it's like machine guns, tanks, hand grenades, RSA algorithm, right? And they're quite serious about it. If you show this to a foreign national or export it out of the country, you can go to jail for 5 years and be fined $100,000 for each effort at doing this. Well, not anymore, but you used to be able to. So a couple of smart-ass hackers tattooed it onto their bodies, right? One of them went up to the Canadian border and said, well, can I leave the country or not? Right? I'm exporting a piece of code. But what's kind of interesting about that is this body can encrypt nothing. Right? By actually attaching the code to the body, what it does is it renders it kind of impotent. Right? It has no power to do anything once it's turned into a kind of body. Interestingly enough, the New York Times and Wired magazine, both with international editions, published similar pictures, turning them into international arms traffickers during the process. Kind of interesting. Okay, so raises the question then, what does it mean to be an outlaw or a technological outlaw? And I would argue that there's actually 3 ways in which you become a technological outlaw. The first is that you end up being ahead of the law. And being ahead of the law is not very difficult, particularly in terms of criminality. So the laws that we use to prosecute most crimes having to do with technology, believe it or not, is the Communication Act of 1934. Right? That's where all of our wire fraud statutes are based. And even if you remember in the 90s, the effort to create a Communications Decency Act to censor obscenity and indecency on the internet was nothing but an amendment to that act. Right? So essentially, we are regulating the internet and criminality on the internet based on a law that was written before television. So it's very easy to be ahead of the law. The law moves very, very slowly, doesn't change very often. And here's a perfect example of this. In Japan, they wanted to arrest a virus writer, but actually found they had no law under which they could do that. And unfortunately for this virus writer, they embedded the virus in an image, and the image had copyright protection. They were able to arrest the hacker based on stealing the image, but not on the actual writing of the virus. So that's the first way. You can be head of the law. The second thing is you can be outside of the law. And that is to say that whatever you're doing, even if it's considered wrong, is something that we have no name for, or at least within inside the law. So there's no claim to regulate it. So we rely on all kinds of outdated metaphors for things like trespass. Right? How is a computer hacker sitting in his mother's basement, typing online, trespassing? Right? When you really think about it, it's very difficult to argue that that's an act of trespass. Trespass is literally about having your body someplace it shouldn't be. That's how the law defines it. Well, your body hasn't moved from your mother's basement. Right? So the words start to break down. They start to cause us problems. No different than the problem we have actually with computer viruses themselves. It's nothing but a biological metaphor, and it's one that causes us a great amount of problems when we start to use it. The third way that we can become an outlaw is that we can be bodiless. We can be incorporeal. And this wreaks havoc with our own ideas of what constitutes the law. Because if we have no body, we can't attach law to it. We can't prosecute it, we can't confine it, we can't punish it, we can't control it. So justice itself starts to break down in the era of the virtual precisely because it lacks a body in order to deal with it. So I want to go through 3 of these cultures and spend some time talking about each of them. And the first is the culture of viruses. And probably the most fascinating thing to me about computer viruses and what got me hooked on them is that starting in about 1984, actually at USC, Len Edelman and his graduate student Fred Cohen, Fred was writing a doctoral dissertation on the topic, and he found very quickly that it's impossible to define what a virus is in common language. The only way you can do it is by using the mathematics of set theory. And you can talk about what properly and does not properly belong to what he constituted as a viral set. And this, from his dissertation, is actually the definition of what a virus is, which probably doesn't sound very much like what you would think a virus was. You think it's a thing that gets on your computer and deletes files. Right? So there's no common language definition of what these things look like. Edelman and Cohen coined the term, and they did it really because that was the best term they could come up with. There's some debate as to whether they coined it or whether a science fiction writer did. But one of the conclusions that they found was that computer viruses are things that belong on networks. And interestingly enough, they argued that the essential nature of computation is repetition. Computers really don't do anything particularly interesting or special other than repeat themselves. And they do it very efficiently, without error, and they go through a process of looping, which makes repetition kind of the core of what they do. Well, viruses are programs which replicate themselves, at least. That's kind of what that says. And in doing so, they kind of fulfill the essential nature of what a computer should be doing. Now, a very particular computer virus occurred on November 2nd, 1988. And this was called the Internet Worm. And it was written by a graduate student at Cornell University named Robert Morris, who happened to be the son of Bob Morris, who was the chief cryptographer for the NSA. If you don't know what the NSA is, that's the people the CIA are afraid of. It was written to exploit a number of security flaws that were found in the Unix and VAX operating systems. And Morris's intended purpose was to measure the size of the internet. He had found a security hole, and what this program did is it went in, it looked for weak passwords, he had a list, I think, of 88 of them, and tried to crack every account. And then it would move on to whatever computers that computer trusted. Right? So it spread very quickly and very easily. The problem was that he put in a fail-safe mechanism so it didn't get too out of control. And he said, if a computer is running this program, it looks and sees if it's already running. And it said, if it is running, I'll give it a 1 in 7 chance for it to continue. So only 14% of the time will the computer continue to run the virus if it sees itself. Unfortunately, that number was off by a factor of about 1,000. So what started to happen was this program would infect a computer, and pretty soon all the computer could do is run that program. It would grind to a halt, and you couldn't even log on, you couldn't do anything. All of the processing power was being used to run a copy of Morse's worm. So this is a fairly significant error in programming, and it pretty much ground the internet to a halt. At the time, it was estimated, it infected about 10% of the entire internet, which is a lot less significant than it would be today, because the internet looked like this. There are about 60,000 computers connected, so it infected about 6,000 of them. If you looked at the network map of the internet today, it would, trust me, not look like this. But you can see what's happening is this is the ARPANET funded by DARPA, and it connected some major research hubs at places like Xerox, mostly with large corporations and major universities, and a couple of government military installations. So this program pretty soon gets out of control. And all of the major universities, which are most of the nodes on this map, really start freaking out because they can't do anything. All their research is shut down, anybody who's using computers. So all of the major universities, USC, Berkeley, Stanford, MIT, everybody's trying to figure out what this thing is, how to stop it. They would unplug their computer from the network, they would completely wipe it, clean it out, plug it back in, and within minutes it would be overwhelmed again, and that's all the computer could do is run this program. And it was 2 scholars at MIT who cracked the problem. And it was a guy by the name of John Rockless and Mark Eichen. And this is where I kind of get a complex, because I met with John Rockless at MIT some years later, and I asked him, what he was working on at the time, and was he faculty, was he a graduate student, what was he doing? He says, gosh, it's been a while, but I think I was a freshman and Mark was a sophomore. Right. So the best minds in the country at Stanford and Berkeley and MIT are trying to figure this out, and it's 2 undergrads who stayed up for 3 days basically hacking the worm to figure out what was going on with it. And they published a very interesting essay it's kind of blurry, in the Communications of the ACM, which is the big journal in computer science and programming. And what they found what they did was they created a line-by-line kind of diagnosis of what this program did. It was not a terribly sophisticated program. They figured out what it did, why it went wrong, how it worked. And they published the article with the title, "With a Microscope and Tweezers." So this is what they did, is they took it apart, they dissected it, they looked at every line by line, and wrote up a very nice summary of what it was, how it functioned, and why it went wrong. In the same issue of the Communications of the ACM, Brian Coker, who was the president that year, also wrote an essay in response to the worm. But he called his essay a hygiene lesson. And his point was something completely different. And it was that we needed to enter an era of what he called safe computing. He said it was like we needed to wash our hands before we touched our keyboards. We needed to have prophylactics on our computers. We needed to treat it like the problems of plague or disease in Calcutta. Right? We needed sewage treatment. We needed all these kind of things. So he invoked this metaphor of hygiene and sanitation. And this became a very interesting debate over what it was we were going to do about making the internet, such as it was, safe. And it really provided 2 prototypes for how we think about this. And they're prototypes we've seen before, and we've seen them in almost every area of scientific investigation. And on one hand, we have what we could call pathological anatomy. This really starts in the 19th century with the idea that instead of treating symptoms in patients, you could actually cut them open, look inside, and see what's wrong with them. So one of the obvious parallels, if we look at the way in which people treat the outbreak of AIDS as a public health threat. So there's a number of researchers who got a lot of money to actually study the virus. So they looked at it with a microscope and tweezers, took the thing apart, figured out how it worked, and worked on drugs to counteract it, looking for ways to deal with it, and so on. On the other hand, we have what we can think of as a model of social control. And this is something that we've seen before as well. In fact, Foucault in Discipline and Punish actually traces out the origin of the French police to the regulation of families and households during the plague. Right? You went around house to house to make sure that people were taking their garbage out, that their water was fresh, that if people were sick, they were quarantined. And that becomes the origin of the modern police state. Right? Well, the same thing is true with this, right? That we move to a model that says, get a virus scanner, keep it updated, don't click on emails from people you don't know, don't run programs that you don't know the origin of, and so on. So all of the burden shifts to the user, right? So now the idea is that you have one model looking at the virus, one model looking at the user. The idea then is that we start to regulate people's behavior. And that's clearly the dominant model that's won out. Right? I mean, probably if I asked you to raise your hands, how many of you either have a virus checking program on your computer or know that you should? Right? Yeah, probably everybody. And if you haven't, right, you should. So I'll play my own little Foucauldian part here. The idea being that it's become such a standard of behavior for the net, right, that we have these rules in place. It's clearly won out. How many of you have ever dissected a line of viral code? Right? That's just not the predominant way we look at this. Interestingly, though, almost every virus writer that got into writing viruses did so because they were infected by a virus, got curious, and looked at it. And almost every single person's first virus is taking the virus they were infected by, changing a few lines of it, and re-releasing it. So there's a way in which the model of viral infection actually plays out, both within the recreation of viruses themselves and of the prevention of them. So the second group I want to talk about are computer hackers. This is exemplified by, for me, probably one of the most famous cases, a hacker by the name of Kevin Mitnick. And Mitnick actually started off his career in hacking not as a computer hacker, but what was called a phone freak. He was very good at breaking into the phone system, manipulating the phone system, and basically playing pranks. He would do fun things like he would turn people's home phones into pay phones. Right? So you pick up the phone and say, if you'd like to make a phone call, please deposit 25 cents. Right? Of course, you can't do that. Another favorite prank was to redirect 411 directory assistance calls to a local payphone, and then he and his friends would answer those calls and really freak people out. And they'd say things like, that phone number is 253-4962.5. Do you know how to dial the half? Right. So they had great fun at people's expense. But not for too long, because pretty soon he discovered that the thing running these phone systems were computers. And by getting into the computer systems, he could do a whole lot more to hack the phone network than he could by just hacking the phones. And unfortunately, this ended up getting him in quite a bit of trouble. Now, his early kind of trouble was that people would show up at his mother's door and say, do you know what your son's up to? And he would get his modem taken away for a week. Not too big of a deal. Eventually, he started hacking from Radio Shacks in Southern California. And he was so good at kind of social engineering people that he could actually get managers oftentimes to keep the Radio Shacks open late so that he could sit there and hack. They had no idea what he was doing, but every Radio Shack had one computer hooked up with a modem that would call back to the central office and update their inventory. He figured this out, he could get on the network, he could hack from there until they figured out what he was doing a few weeks later, and then they'd kick him out of the store. But fortunately for him, there were a lot of Radio Shacks in Southern California. So he would just go from Radio Shack to Radio Shack to Radio Shack, building up his knowledge of how the system worked, and he was able to kind of talk himself into to doing things. It's not too long, though, in the early 90s, he actually gets in a fair bit of trouble. He gets arrested. He goes to court, and he ends up actually pleading computer addiction and gets sent to a halfway house for a 12-step program to manage his computer addiction. And one of the most fascinating things to me about this whole instance is that there were 4 different reporters that wrote about this. And he had been very heavy as a kid. And the stories were all written that he went to the halfway house, he was not allowed to touch a computer, and he lost 100 pounds. And those 3 things are always written in the same sentence together and imply a kind of causality, that as soon as he stopped touching the computer, he lost all the weight. Right? His body became a kind of obsession for people reporting about that. Now, the thing that they left out was they also, in that time period, became a vegetarian. So, now, I can't say with complete certainty that was what caused him to lose 100 pounds, but if I had to guess between not touching a computer and becoming a vegetarian, if I was a betting person, that's where I'd go. So he gets out of jail, he gets out of his halfway house, he's on probation, and according to him, he skips his last probation meeting and moves because he's living in Southern California, his mother's moved to Las Vegas, he wants to go be with her for Christmas. So he tells his PO, I'm taking off, I'm going to go, is that a problem? The parole officer says, no, go ahead, we're done, this is your last meeting. You've been great. So he takes off. He finds out that this is not exactly accurate, and there's now a bench warrant out for his arrest for violating his parole and fleeing town. Right. Now, while he was actually in jail awaiting his trial, the prosecutors had told the court that he was a threat because he could probably get to a payphone, whistle into it, put a virus on the net, and start a nuclear war. The 80-year-old judge, who has never touched a computer before, says, that sounds reasonable to me. So tells the warden he may not have access to a phone. The warden says, the only way I can do that is to put the guy in solitary. So he spends a little over a month in solitary confinement, right, which is an awful thing to have happen to you. No human contact for a month. So he has a very bad taste in his mouth about jail. He finds out that he may be going back there, so he flees. Well, this leads a reporter for the New York Times, John Markoff, to write a front-page story about the fact that the FBI now cannot catch the elusive hacker Kevin Mitnick, which of course makes the FBI very angry and want to catch Kevin Mitnick. But they actually can't do that. They run into a lot of problems. And they actually put out this poster, and you can see this is, taken before the weight loss, trying to track him down. And this literally becomes a hunt for the body, a manhunt, right? To track down the physical representation of the hacker so that they can put him back in jail. Whether he does this or not is sort of an open question, but he runs afoul of a person at the Supercomputer Center in San Diego named Susumu Shimomura. And Shimomura believes that he's hacked his system and takes it a matter of honor to track him down. So a number of months later, Markoff, Shimomura, and the FBI are sitting outside of Mitnick's apartment in a van with a handheld cell device, tracking down a cell phone call that he's making, and they end up arresting him. It's 1995. Now, what Mitnick was actually doing was he was calling up cell phone companies, pretending to work for them, and having them send copies of their operating systems so he could hack their phones. He called it the Mitnick plan, which was $0 down and 0 cents a minute. He wanted to make free phone calls so he could continue hacking. And while we can all agree that that's something that's illegal and not good to do, it winds up costing him 5 years in jail and a very lengthy process. He has a 23-count federal indictment filed against him, which would have put him away for 80 years with $100 million in fines if he had been convicted. He ended up taking a plea bargain and doing 5 years for it. That becomes a very interesting example. That's Shimamura. And it gets written up by Markov, first as a story in the New York Times about the samurai and the cyber thief. Gets turned into a book called Takedown, which gets optioned for a movie for $750,000. So Markov's stories change from the evening before the arrest of, most wanted computer hacker, blah, 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 to the day after the arrest when a book deal is signed to the samurai and the cyber thief facing each other down and high drama. So that's the first kind of case of hacking. The second is a case of Kevin Poulsen, who's also a very interesting figure. And the reason he's an interesting figure is that he is also very good with the telephone system. And what he would do is he would rig the phones with Kiss FM in Los Angeles so that he would be the only person calling in. And they would say, hey, to win a trip to Hawaii, be the 35th caller. And he would sit there and hang up 34 times and then go, hey, am I it, am I it, am I it? Right? He was the only person calling in. He ended up winning a trip to Hawaii, a large sum of money, and a Porsche. The problem is that he can't go claim all these prizes, right? So he ends up having to create fake IDs. He hacks the DMV. He gets driver's licenses with different identities, gives them to his friends, and so on. He actually gave the Porsche to somebody else. Well, they figure out eventually what's going on, that they've been scammed, and they also can't catch him. Turns out that he's actually in the database for the FBI and the local police, so every time they come to raid, he's been reading their emails and following their databases. So he knows they're coming, and he disappears a day beforehand. Right? He leaves them nasty little notes and all kinds of things. So it really is this kind of catch as catch can kind of thing. Now, the police are really, really annoyed. So where do they turn? Right? To Robert Stack. And they go to Robert Stack and say, here's this guy, here's what he's been doing, we'd like your help in arresting him. We've got a picture, we know what he looks like. And the producers of Unsolved Mysteries, after they stop laughing, say, our show is about murderers and criminals, arsonists, pedophiles. We take on serious cases of people that have been abducted, not people who rip off Rick Dees at Kiss FM. Right? They say, oh, well, we also think he may have violated national security. They have come across a locker that has a number of emails from when he did consulting for the military that at the bottom have the tagline, this is the property of the U.S. government. If this is shown to anyone outside, blah, 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 this is a violation of these federal statutes. So now cut to Unsolved Mysteries. Robert Stack saying, one of America's most wanted criminals, national security threat, blah, blah, blah. Well, Poulsen knows this is airing. And he thinks, what am I going to do about this? His first thought is he's going to climb the hill up to the transmitter from the studio, and just as they're going to air this, he's going to cut the power lines, and the station will go dead. He thinks, that might work, but the problem is then I just show up on the next Unsolved Mysteries as the guy who cut the power lines, right? And I also might electrocute myself because I don't really know what I'm doing. Better, what I'll do is I'll watch the episode, and as soon as they put up the 800 number to call in, I'm going to make all of the phones go dead at Unsolved Mysteries, which is what he does. Right? So he completely blanks out for 2 hours all of the incoming calls. Very proud of himself. He goes out to pick up some food, some dinner, some beer at Hughes Market, and as he's leaving, screaming across the parking lot, comes the bag boy, who has seen Unsolved Mysteries that night, tackles him, holds him down, makes the citizen's arrest. And in ignominious defeat, Kevin Poulsen is arrested by a bag boy from Hughes Market, something the FBI and the local police could not do. Right? But why? They recognized the body. Right? It became this kind of active surveillance in which the body became something which could be apprehended. Right? They couldn't catch him before. Paulson, interestingly, went on to become a writer and editor for Wired, and in a moment of kind of geeky trivia, he's also the person who wrote the first story about the Y2K impending disaster, and unfortunately he wrote it making fun of the survivalists in the desert who were banking on this happening, and his point was that this probably isn't going to happen, but it got picked up and turned around, and so he's sort of the father of that moment, for good or ill. All right, so the third group to talk about are gamers. They look like your kids? Any chance? Yeah. And this one I want to talk a little bit about the fears of games and where they're located. And this is very specifically between the virtual and the real. And unfortunately, part of the problem is that we understand where we think of games as learning systems, which is both good and bad. But we're so locked in to an idea that learning is about transfer, that whatever we're seeing on the screen is what's getting into the kid's head. And the same debate we've been having about violent movies, about cartoons, about all those things. And as much as people look, they find it very hard to find strong evidence for it actually happening. And just a small little plug, I've got a new book coming out called A New Culture of Learning, which is exactly about this, to suggest that learning in virtual spaces is not about transfer of information, but it's about the enculturation of dispositions, right, of learning how to perceive the world in particular ways, which kind of goes back to where I started with Huizinga, right, this idea that we learn how to reflect upon the world by doing things in these virtual spaces. Now, the uber case study of this is a game called Grand Theft Auto. Anybody know this game, play this game, love this game, hate this game? A number of times I've talked about this, and game study scholars hate this game because it's the one we're always asked to defend. Right? And it's kind of hard to defend. You run around and pull people out of cars and beat them with baseball bats, steal their stuff, murder prostitutes. That's kind of the game dynamic. And none of us really wants to defend that. Although there's some interesting cases. And what we find is the knee-jerk reaction is to want to do this. Right? And what I find fascinating in this argument is there's a particular game that has caused a lot of problems. Throughout its play, it's been called frivolous, it's been called time-wasting, politically subversive. It's been objected to on religious grounds. One of the primary arguments is that the time that you play it takes away from doing important things like studying science or learning how to read. A number of times people have argued that players are prone to unhealthy preoccupation with the game. It has been condemned roundly by Christians, by Jews, and by Muslim leaders. It has been considered an act of debauchery. It has officially been condemned as useless, and has been banned 27 times by governments. And that game is chess. Right? Over 1,500 years, and the last time it was banned in Iran, I think, was 1988. So it's been a relatively recent phenomenon. Now, we understand things about chess, right? Nobody believes, literally, this is a game that promotes regicide. I mean, that's what the game is about. It's about killing the other person's king, right? But nobody thinks of it that way. We think about it as an analytic game. We think about it as a game of strategy. We think about it as improving mathematical skills. Think of all the positive attributes that we think about coming from chess and why we want kids to play it. None of them has anything to do with knowing how a pawn moves, knowing what a bishop or a rook is, knowing what a king or a queen are, or how they move or how they work. Right? All of the value is dispositional. Right? None of the things about chess, knowing that a bishop moves only diagonally, transfers to the real world. Right? But lots of other things do. Right? So mostly, games have been attacked for their relationship to the body. One of the most notorious examples of that has been Columbine. I don't know if you all follow this, but in a rather notorious example, it spawned perhaps one of the most pernicious category errors of modern times, which promoted a whole string of scholarship, of grants, of writing about this, asking, do games make kids violent and do things like create Columbine? Which, if you look at the empirical evidence, which is the real world, if it did, given that there are millions of kids playing these games since the 70s, we shouldn't have an anomaly like Columbine. We should have them happening on a routine basis pretty much every day, given the pervasiveness of this kind of play. So the question, did video games do this, is one that we already know the answer to, which is no, right? Because if it did, then we would see it a lot more. So in a way, this kind of anecdotal example demands a kind of anecdotal analysis. Right? We need to understand it as an anecdote. Unfortunately, those things are anathema to lots of researchers. Anecdote becomes a very dirty word. So this is one case in which we took the virtual and the fears became attached to the body. And I would argue without much merit. A second case this is happening is around childhood obesity. This was a really interesting ad that ran suggesting that if you play video games, you die, right? Which seems a little bit extreme. But it's not just in the US. There was a very interesting number of studies that happened in Japan. And there was a great fear of what they called game brain. They believed that actually, this is a popular kind of myth, that playing games actually burned out the frontal lobe in children's brains. Right? That's what the parents were afraid of. And they were very, very worried about the obsessive nature of kids playing and the amount of time they spent with games. And I was absolutely fascinated to read the research on this and talk to the people that study it in Japan, because what constitutes an obsession of playing games in Japan is, for the average kid, 3 hours a week. Right? That is what they think of as being too much. Right? I'll compare that to kids in America, where 3 hours a day is considered, not out of control. But if you play something like World of Warcraft, having an 8 to 9 hour gaming session where you do a raid is standard fare. So the idea of attaching those kind of fears again to the body becomes very real. It's a way in which we can understand or try to understand the virtual. Most recently, there was a amazing episode of the show South Park about the World of Warcraft. And one of the progressions that happens is these fourth grade kids who are varying ethnicities, body types, and so on, but who we've seen for something like 12 years in their standard body form, slowly as they play World of Warcraft, by the end of the episode, they become transformed. And by the end, this is what they look like. So here we have, again, the fear of the corruption of the body happening around games. Right? And this becomes the way in which we can deal with this. All right, so I want to kind of end by suggesting a couple of things, 3 things. The first is to suggest, broadly to suggest, that the law itself is already virtual. And this is the reason we have such problem applying it to the virtual space. And if you think about the law, it's divided between 2 things. On one hand, the notion of generality. We have to write laws that apply widely to a variety of circumstances. We don't say John Smith may not drive his car at 45 miles an hour. We say no one can, right? Or 55 or 65 or whatever. But we never arrest people generally. We only arrest people through the kind of particularization of the law. So the law is always a kind of conflict between the general in the writing of it and the particular in the enforcement of it. Now, the first interesting aspect of that is I want to argue that the law is itself viral. And it's viral in exactly the same way that computer viruses are, and it's problematic in precisely the same way, that all definitions of what constitute a particular law fail. There is no common language definition. The only expression we have of a definition of law is what we do in terms of courts, which is we have a particular case that we try. Right? So the law only has meaning insofar as it's particular. It never has meaning in its general sense. And if we think about the law as general, we're constantly faced with a yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. So we can say killing is always wrong. Well, except when the state does it in certain circumstances, or during war, or if it's self-defense. And then there's, if it's accidental, it's manslaughter, and if you're waiting for somebody, it's first degree, and if you do it accidentally, but you have bad intention, maybe it's second degree. Right? Suddenly it gets very, very complicated. So what is killing? Well, depends. Right? There is no definition of it. Right? Only as it's made particular. And this is the same thing that happens with computer viruses. There's no virus until there's a virus, and then the virus is the thing itself. I would also say that law also, like the virtual, only has meaning when it particularizes itself in terms of a specific body. Right? A law that's never prosecuted ceases to really be a law. And we've all seen the kind of stories of in a certain town in Kansas on a Sunday, it's illegal to throw a knife at a man in a striped suit. Right? There's all those kind of laws that are on the books that we laugh at because they have no meaning. Right? You know that they're there because some particular case happened, right, that needed to be addressed, but the law itself is general. Second, I would say that the law is virtual in that it is itself a system of hacking as it's practiced. It's about finding the limits and testing the limits of what constitutes that general category. We're always looking for the exceptions and we're always looking at the edges. And this is essentially what hackers do. They ask questions about the edges and the limits. So when they find a new browser like Microsoft's Internet Explorer, they look at that little bar at top and say, I bet this is made to put in an address that's 30 characters, 60 characters, 100 characters long. What happens if I put in one that's 10,000 long? What if I put in one that's 1 million long? Right? I test the edge cases and see where things break. Another great example of this was in New York City when they started doing the subway cards. A bunch of hackers said, you don't want to do an unlimited subway card, an unlimited pass. And they said, yeah, we do. So about 35 hackers positioned themselves strategically at turnstiles in Grand Central Station and other busy places and just stood there with an unlimited pass and swiped it for every single person that came by. Right? Why not? They thought that was kind of an interesting hack. You see these kind of things happening all the time. So what you're trying to do is push the boundaries, test the limits, see what's possible within what looks like a world of constraints. That's exactly what law does, or exactly what lawyers do, more to the point. And finally, I want to argue that in keeping with Huizinga, that the law itself is a system of play. And he's very careful to say that play doesn't mean non-serious. In fact, some of our most serious things are about play. All culture is play. But play for him is also our most sacred and most serious space. It's the place where we see the deepest things about our culture come out. But play is a contest. And what we have to understand about law is that the law is a battle. It's a contest. It's waged between two sides. And if you read others like Lyotard on the issue of just gaming, or even going back to Derrida and Benjamin on the critique of violence, all of these things have their roots in contest, in conflict, in struggle. And that the law is nothing but a system of play, where there are winners and there are losers, and that is how the law gets tested. So the point that I would make, just as a way of summary, and then I think we'll do a question and answer session, it's because these things embody and perform the kind of contradictions in the law that the law has so much trouble handling them. Right? They expose the law for what it is, and in fact they enact their own kind of laws in a way which make them incompatible with what we think of the physical world or the bodily construct of law. So thank you very much.
About rating the computer games, like the DDG, PG,
Yeah.
so when the signal is it's checked whether
Yeah. They do, and that was one of those things like the record industry, which became a industry-wide enforcement. The problem is, it's a bit like everything else, right? Which is, you want the craziest, bloodiest, most radical game possible. So if you can get on the nightly news as the most damaging thing to kids ever, every single kid wants to go play that game, right? But kids are fascinating about this. That I interviewed one kid who played Grand Theft Auto, and one of the modes you can play Grand Theft Auto in is as a taxi driver, where you shuttle people around the city. And I was watching him play, and he was running over people constantly. And I thought, this is really strange. And I did the unthinkable thing, which was I stopped and asked him why he was doing that. And he had figured out the game mechanic was that if you hit the person, they fall down, they become stationary, and then they get in your cab so you can shuttle them around. So it was the way you pick up people, because if you just stop at the corner and wait for people, it takes forever. So if you run them over, they'll get right in. Right? So it's not what it looks like at all. Right? And so often with these games, they're being used in really amazing and creative ways. It's a bit like cartoons as well. I mean, no kid walks away from Wile E. Coyote thinking they can jump off a cliff and they're going to be fine in a puff of smoke at the bottom. That kids are pretty smart about that. They don't confuse the violence of games with the violence of the real world very often. So yeah, they've taken an incentive and they put mature warnings and things like that on their games, which is just another way to sell them to underage kids. I mean, retailers can try to prevent that, but I think it's been largely ineffective.
First, just thank you for a really stimulating talk. And wanted to ask you to maybe elaborate a little bit on the sort of the three observations about law with which to talk, and to chat pretty quickly. And I like the symmetry very much of thinking about law as virtual and as viral and as kind of a rooted place.
Yeah.
But because I have it quickly, I guess I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about what you would have us do with those observations about the law. Do they, for you, primarily sort of feed back into the way that we think about the virtual world? Or are they for you sort of broader observations about law and the way that we misrecognize law as somehow the opposite of viral, virtual, and living?
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering, too, whether you see this project as having something to do with the sort of growing interest in forms of order without law, right? Forms of sort of spontaneous mores or codes that happen sort of nested within legal frameworks that aren't really dictated by them. You might say that those are also viral, virtual, and ludic, but
absolutely,
they're not law, right? They're sort of nestled in the intricacies of the law. So I'm curious how you see this project as sort of speaking to that formation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which there's a huge amount there to unpack. I mean, one of my real concerns that is kind of tangential, but this question raises, is the fact that virtual spaces have their own kind of constructions of order, of surveillance, of mores, of morality, and all of those kind of things, which do appear to grow in a kind of organic way. And I think that's incredibly important to recognize. But the other thing that we have underlying that is probably the most sophisticated system of surveillance ever. Right? We've gotten to the point where we literally can watch everything, and we have enough power in our databases to process everything. So there's a sense in which, I worry that the game of surveillance itself masks the actual kind of process of surveillance that underwrites that and feeds back into the creation of the game itself, because the developers are always kind of watching. But to go back to the other question of these bigger pictures about the law and the virtual. I mean, I think that it's, we're at a moment where these things are no longer kind of out there. They're no longer on the edges. They're no longer part of the fringe or something that people, small segments of the population do, that they're beginning to create a space which is if you take that real virtual binary, is really becoming a both-and space rather than an either-or. So we're starting to see those things construct each other in really meaningful ways. And right now, there are all of these incredible debates going on about things like virtual taxation. If a really valuable sword from World of Warcraft drops in the game and it's worth $600 on eBay, should I be paying taxes on it? Which, at first blush seems like a really silly question. But what it starts to reveal is that our taxation code is not based on things like W-2s and income. It's based on the value of things that we have in the world. And suddenly, once virtual things can have value, we have a whole different set of questions. I know a number of people in the virtual world Second Life who create clothing in that world. One of whom put herself through college by selling pixels, essentially, to other people for imaginary currency that can be turned into real dollars. Right? So we're starting to see that space kind of inflect on one another, and it is a space which is both lawless but highly organized. So what does that tell us about the way in which law functions, should or shouldn't function in our own social spaces? I do think that it starts to point to the fact that, in a way, the law has all of these gaps, these reversals, these fissures in it that we need to start taking seriously. And maybe the virtual starts to point to some of the ways in which the law is not about precise definition like we think it is. The way in which the law is about a constant system of hacking and rewriting and reprocessing. Partly the point I think Leotard and others have made is that this idea of justice is incredibly problematic too, to put it as something outside the law which is influencing it. One of the things that I watched happen with the Mitnick case, I went to all of his pretrial hearings, is I had this, because I watched too much TV, I had this notion that prosecutors were tough but fair, right? And constrained by the rules and had to play that way. These guys were vicious, right? I watched one day, they handed half hour before court an 80-page brief to the judge. She came in furious. She screamed at them for 15 minutes. And I asked them afterwards, why would you do that? This is clearly hurting your case. And she said, the prosecutor said to me, oh, no. When she's really pissed off, all of her decisions go against the defendant. Right? So, those kind of things. These guys play hardball and they're kind of win at any cost. Well, that's a game, right? And trust me, you go talk to people in a battleground of player versus player, they have exactly the same kind of attitude. So there's something that these spaces are telling us about the way in which the world functions. They're reflective, again, of those kind of things. So there was a lot in that question. I don't know if I did it justice or not. But
I guess the one thing I would ask as a follow-up is that the talk sort of begins by identifying the ways in which the law is related with respect to virtual technologies, right? And this is, I think about intellectual property law, this is a complaint you hear all the time in that space, right? That the technology is way out in front of the law. And yet your talk ends by saying that the law is sort of always already all the things that it's not yet.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a funny kind of fold in time which would be fun to sort of think some more about.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And the law has its own kind of built-in defense mechanism, right? It's always behind and it's always ahead. It's always anticipating through the particularization and always failing in the general, right? So it's that notion of application. It's almost a kind of hermeneutic that's going on in terms of that it's constantly playing catch-up. But it has this incredible resilience. I think of that Japanese case with that virus writer, and it's at once terrifying and also brilliant, right? The way in which that these things can kind of get stitched together in interesting moments like that.
I've got a question, if I can ask if no one else. The legal implications of hacking and gaming are really interesting, but I wanted to draw you back to this sort of what you call the new culture of learning in gaming and the effects on the mind and the body, right, of gaming, whether they're positive or negative. You're sort of quoted as a guy who says they're good for the kids, right? I don't know whether that's accurate, but So a new culture of learning, which you describe in terms of development dispositions. This would be different from schooling in the Foucauldian sense, a sort of dressage and sort of kind of disciplining and punishing, type of schooling that he theorized. But is it new? Is it right to call it a new culture of learning? And I was struck by your example of chess, where what you seemed to be saying was that, in fact, these interactive games that we think of as new are, in many respects, very similar to this oldest of games, chess, and that the ways that they incline the habitus, or the kinds of disposition and strategy that the player develops through that kind of play would be very similar to what chess players do, because of course we think of chess as good for children by and large, and people who are better at chess are better citizens, or I don't know, better at life, or something like that. Now that may be challengeable too, but anyway, so do you in fact see this culture of learning, this sort of dispositional learning through gaming as new, or is it as old as the hills?
I mean, I think it's as old as the hills, but I think that our system of education has been designed as best it can to eradicate it. And the key word for us has been imagination, right? That the new culture of learning is about cultivating imagination, which chess is about cultivating imagination, gaming is about cultivating imagination. And imagination is something that you can't test with a standardized test, right? In fact, it's by definition outside of those standards. Yes, those things have always been there, and I think that they've had less and less importance, particularly in an age of mechanization, through the early 20th century, telerization, preparing people for jobs in factories. Those things are not imaginative work, really since the Industrial Revolution. And we're finding ourselves at a moment of kind of crisis, because even if our kids can test really well on these tests, it has no promise for things like innovation. Right, which is what almost everybody agrees is the crisis in education right now, is we're not training people to be innovators. So we look at spaces like World of Warcraft, not the game. We look at what's happening around the game. We've got a game that's producing about 15,000 pieces of new information every night. Right? And you've got these guilds that are able to process that kind of bulk of knowledge in an efficient way and make it meaningful. You've got kids that are playing this game, and the tools for evaluating themselves and each other aren't good enough. So they're creating their own sort of 360-degree evaluative tools to see what's happening in raids, putting them online, understanding the mathematics behind statistical analysis of play. Right? And they're not doing this because it's an assignment. They're doing it because it's fun. Right? Because it aids the imagination. It lets them go places they couldn't go without it. So we're seeing all these wonderful acts of creative imagination, of wikis, of forums, of databases, of spreadsheets people are writing. And all of this is growing out of a passion to learn. And so I would say that's always been with us, and that's sort of, if you look at any 4-year-old, that's what you see. The wonder of imagination, of looking at the world for the first time and saying, oh my God, look at that thing, it's really cool, what do I do with it? I'm going to touch it, I'm going to eat it, I'm going to hit it, whatever. And try to make sense of the world through it. We all play for children is learning, and all learning is in some sense play. And you go to a 4th grade teacher, and that's the thing that terrifies them the most. Right? Play will be structured from 4:15 to 4:45. It will be done in this area, in this sandbox with these toys. Right?
So you don't see, just to follow up, one of the critiques that you hear, especially of the shooter games, which have become so dominant, is that it's not really play. It's actually this sort of system of constraints in which you compete in a quite regimented way, and it's goal-seeking, repetitive behavior, and it's nicely training kids to be, corporate citizens in the neoliberal dog-eat-dog world, but it's not, in fact, expanding their imagination.
Yeah, I would say that I don't necessarily want to be tagged as the games or the all games are good guy. I think some games are better than others, and I think that some of the quote-unquote learning games, which are quote-unquote highly effective, are also designed to do exactly that, which is kill the imagination. Some of the fun games are too. I think we need to understand the way in which the games are working, and more important than the games themselves, what are the cultures that grow up around the games? So I would, rather than look at the first-person shooters, I would go look at the people who are making the web pages and the strategy guides and participating in the forums and are doing the calculations about what this big gun does versus what this hand grenade does. I mean, that's where the imagination happens. The game itself is incidental. For me, the least interesting thing about games are usually the games themselves. What's interesting is the people. And the users and what they're doing with them. So yeah, it's hard for me to get too upset about the critiques of particular games like Grand Theft Auto, or just like you wouldn't get upset about chess. I mean, how dare you make the bishop move diagonally, I mean, it doesn't make much sense, right? So even the idea of repetition and things like that in those games, I don't disagree that there may be some truth to that criticism, and it should be evaluated and should be talked about. But I also, like I said, there are other elements of creativity that happen around it.
I'm just curious about the mixes when you claimed a psychological addiction, and if that's something that's happened in other cases. Because I'm thinking in terms of creativity in the arts, where when things like passion and this extreme obsession with something that's very morally labeled and savage or whatever, and then we have more civilized, controlled aspect of our society. So I wonder if that psychological component has come up in other cases.
This is a common defense, right? My client couldn't help himself because he's computer obsessed, he's addicted to the computer and so on, and internet addiction is, actually becoming something that people are talking about in a clinical sense, and gaming addiction and all of these kind of things. And again, it's one of those models that, to me doesn't quite fit, because when we look at things like addiction to, chemical dependency, it's a very different kind of phenomenon. And I think that we need a new way of describing that. One of my colleagues, Dimitri Williams at USC, categorizes it as unhealthy play, right? Which I think is a much better way of kind of thinking through that. And hacking's the same kind of thing, right? And if you go back to the kind of law as play metaphor, or maybe it's not a metaphor, it was very clearly a ploy on the part of his attorney to say, hey, we have this, when people do a lot of drugs and do bad things, we excuse that behavior and we put them in a 12-step program. So why not do it with this too? And I know Kevin never believed he was addicted to anything. Right? He didn't even think he was compulsive, and yet he would spend 72 hours awake trying to get a single password. So there is a bit of compulsion there, and so on. I think that it's an interesting kind of moment where we're looking at those things and trying to understand them through lenses that seem to be appropriate when maybe they aren't. The same problem happens with even a metaphor of a computer virus. You're locked into a kind of biological metaphor that fails in a lot of ways and causes us problems in terms of how we think about what's going on.
We have one or two more questions.
Now, I have a question. You were talking earlier about how games influence the learning environment. The New York Times recently published an article about a public school in New York that was founded on the idea that gaming can perpetuate learning, and that it can teach us in so many different ways. That there could be games about civilization that can teach us crucial pieces that go into civilizations. How do you feel that game and play will influence learning environments in schools in the future?
Hopefully positively and hopefully not. One of the problems I run into all the time is my colleagues come to me and say, my research is really, really important. I should make a game about it. Right? And it always ends in disaster, right? Because they're not game designers. And one of the things that's happening in those schools, which is fascinating, is not that they're necessarily saying kids should play games. But one example is a school that's constructed around games by Katie Salen. And what they do is they create games. Right? So you want to create a basketball game? you have to learn the physics of how a ball moves in terms of shooting and so on. So now why are you learning that physics? Because it's on a test, or because it's in a book, because it's a set of equations? No, because you have a passion, you want to create the basketball game, and you love basketball, and now you can know the physics of how it works. And the question is, wow, how do I make that ball actually bounce? What does that look like? Now you have a real incentive to learn that kind of stuff. So game design itself can be a really powerful motive. But it's also, we can think of one of the things we talk about in the paper you said at the beginning on the gamer disposition is that lots of gamers have what we call a questing disposition, which is saying, like, I'm on a quest, I know the resources to solve my problem exist in the world, it's just a matter of assembling them in a productive way or in one of multiple ways to solve the problem. That's what a great model for education, right? That here I've got a problem, it's not how do I find the answer, it's how do I assemble resources in order to make something good. And part of what we talk about in the new culture of learning is that the goal of education shouldn't be about answers, it should be about learning how to ask better questions. And one of the things we find with gamers is immediately when they figure the answer to something, they're done with it. All it does is allow them to get to the next level. And the next level is what's interesting. New problems, right? New questions. So I think that model is a very game-like model to think about how is it that every class, every lecture, everything we engage with is about getting to the next level of learning rather than finding the answer and stopping. So I'd say that those are some powerful models that could really be used for education.